The Jewish Bible, also known as the Tanakh, is the canonical collection of Jewish texts. It is divided into three main sections. The first section is the Torah, the teaching or the law, also known as the Pentateuch. It includes the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And it contains the foundational laws and narratives of the Jewish faith. The Neviim, which is the second part, is called the prophets. This section includes historical narratives and prophetic writings such as Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12 minor prophets. And the last section, also known as the Ketuvim or writings, is a diverse collection of books that includes poetry, wisdom, literature, and other such writings as Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Song of Solomon, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, Esther, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles, 1st and 2nd. The Tanakh is the central theme of Jewish religious life, the thought containing historical context, laws, ethical teachings, and prophecies. It is written primarily in Hebrew with some of the parts in Aramaic. The Tanakh serves as the spiritual and moral foundation of Judaism, and for Christians or believers, it should serve as our moral foundation. This is Dr. Ray, and welcome to this week's Hosea International Speaks. This week, we're only going to review and then pick up from where we left off about 6 months ago. We have been on a different path over the last few months, dealing with the ecclesia or the church, which was in a very needed diversion, which was a needed diversion at the time, being that the church is under attack, or was and still is. And the attack that has come against us is of nobody's fault but the church itself. The church has sought to try and stay out of the certain sections of society, mainly the 7 mountains of culture. And because she has decided to remain anonymous, she has suffered a setback. And just to remind those what are those 7 cultural areas of society? They are religion, family, government, business, education, media, arts, and entertainment. But I'm happy to say that she is getting back into the fight, and she will come forth to become the glorious ecclesia, as mentioned in Ephesians chapter 5 and 27. But now, we're going to have to go back just about to session 59, if you would like to go to pick up from there where we left off, and in the study of the Old Testament. And we began with the book of Genesis. Now, let's review a bit so that we can get caught up where we left off, where we began and started. We said we began about 2 years ago that we should let the stories that are read in the Old Testament speak to us. That is, what is Yahweh revealing to me about myself, about my surroundings, and about himself? The scripture says in Proverbs 25:2, it is the glory of Yahweh to conceal a thing, but the honor of kings is to search out a matter. If you was to look at in the Hebrew concerning this verse, the translators interpreted the word dabar as to conceal a thing or to search out a matter, so that the real interpretation should read like this: it is the glory of Elohim to conceal a word or his word. And the Hebrew word for is thing, which is dabar. And the word for matter is the word dabar. So it says, it is the glory of Elohim to conceal or hide the word, and it is the honor of kings to search out the word. So in order to find out what Yahweh has hidden in his word, we're going to have to search it out diligently. Yahweh gave us the scriptures so that we might have or walk on a firm foundation. And what better way than to start off a new Christian life or life as a believer than with the book of Genesis? I said that time and time again. As we continue our study of the Old Testament, we'll be going through it based on the Jewish Bible and how it is divided. To a Hebrew, the first 5 books of the Bible is called the Tanakh, or the Torah, the Torah. And the rest of the Old Testament is divided into what is known as the Neviim, or the prophets, and the Ketuvim, the writings. This is how the whole Hebrew Bible is divided. Jesus gave validity or credence to the Tanakh, which is the Old Testament, which is what the Jewish people call the Old Testament. They call it the Tanakh. When he mentioned the deaths, Jesus mentioned the deaths of Abel and Zechariah. We can see that in Matthew chapter 23:35 and Luke 11:51. And he says this, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Now, what do you mean by Jesus giving validity? Well, Abel was murdered in the very first book of the Tanakh, the book of Genesis. And Zechariah was murdered in the last book of the Tanakh. But you say, Second Chronicles is in the writings of the book, which is in the middle of the Bible. Yes, according to the English Bible, Chronicles is in the middle. But in the Tanakh, Second Chronicles is the last book. The Neviim, the prophets, is the second section of the Tanakh. So this gives us the division of the Hebrew Bible. But then each book of the Torah, or the first 5 books, has its own divisions. Genesis has 12 subdivisions, or divided into 12 parts, which we mentioned back in the teachings that the number 12 stands for government. So that Genesis is saying that this is the standard of government in the kingdom of Yahweh. And you will have to go back to session number 2 or 3 to learn the different divisions there. I could give it, but it would be time consuming. Who wrote the Torah, or who wrote the first 5 books of the Old Testament? The Talmud, which is a Jewish interpretation of the Torah, holds that the Torah was written by Moses, with the exception of the last 8 verses of Deuteronomy, which describes his death and burial, probably written by Joshua. We also looked at creation and exactly what happened between chapter 1, verse 1, and chapter 1, verse 2. We went into the what I call the restoration process. Many theologians and teachers call this the first 2 verses as creation, recreation. I have resorted to call it the creation restoration process because that is exactly what happened. Again, you may have to stop here and go back and check those earlier sessions. We looked at the creation of man and woman. We saw what caused their fall and who it was that deceived them, how Yahweh handled the situation. We went through the fall and the flood and how Yahweh used a man by the name of Noah to save humanity. We also looked at how man tried to build his own tower in order to reach the heavens or to never be caught in another earth-devastating flood, just to confuse in their language when Yahweh removed their understanding of one another. He came down and he took away their understanding. He didn't cause confusion. He took away what belonged to him, which was understanding. Then Yahweh chose a man by the name of Abram, who would later become Abraham, in order to give land to, because of the sin and degradation that was happening. In this part of Genesis, of the Genesis story, we see how 2 nations were birthed, the Jewish state and the Islamic state. I will state here that Abram and Hagar were the father and mother of Ishmael. And Abraham and Sarah was the father and mother of Isaac. It would be a regeneration process because of what Yahweh had to do in the physical bodies of Abraham and Sarah in order for Isaac to be born. Two totally different sets of couple, though they were the same body. You have to understand that if you want to go back and research those sections again. We see the journey of Abraham in order to enact the agreement between Abraham and Yahweh, in which Abraham had to walk the land promised to him and his seed. He was commanded by Yahweh to walk the land. You can see that in Genesis chapter 13, verse 17. He says to Abraham, arise, walk in the land through its length and width, for I give it to you. It was the first time Yahweh spoke to Abraham since his separation from Lot, or after he had told him to leave his land and then come to a land that I will show you. And then he did not speak to him again until he separated from Lot. It seems that Lot may have been a hindrance to Abraham's walk with Yahweh. We also talked about the death of Sarah at the age of 127. This was devastating to Isaac, who only knew of Sarah, whom she had at the age of 90, and Abraham was 100. And because Abraham was getting old, was not getting any older, and Isaac is now about 37 years old, Abraham had to find a wife for him, and he sent his servant Eliezer to find one from amongst his family that lived in the Ur of the Chaldees. Eliezer returns with Rebekah to be Isaac's wife. Isaac was comforted, says the scripture, after the death of his mother. Abraham would marry again, having 6 more sons, whom he sent eastward when they were of age, with gifts. Now listen to this possibility, my own belief and interpretation. I believe the kings that he sent, or the men or the boys or the sons that he sent eastward, I believe those are the kings of the east that brought gifts to Jesus when he was 2 years old. And I believe that they might have been distant relatives through the lineage of Abraham and his next wife that he had after Sarah, Keturah. The birth of Jacob also and Esau occur also in chapter 25, and then begins the rift between the two, in which Esau lost his birthright. But he was also about to lose probably the most important part of his livelihood. This would bring us up to chapter 26 of Genesis, where another famine hits the land and Yahweh had promised to Abraham. And guess what? Isaac started on the same path as his father Abraham, which would take him to Egypt. But Yahweh intervenes and tells him to stay where he's at. And he is blessed 100-fold after sowing into the land. Now, with that, it takes us up to the chapter 27. So let's take a peek in here of 27, and we'll pick it up again next week. Isaac is getting old. His vision is almost nil. He's unable to see much of all. He gives Esau an assignment to bring some of the venison that he has come to love. Rebekah overhears the task, tells Jacob what he must do at this point. Well, we'll pick this up next week, starting with chapter 27. If you want to go ahead and read it, and you can be up there with me when I start to give the lesson. If you enjoyed this week's summary of go ahead and hit the like button. And if you wish to subscribe, if you have not subscribed yet, go ahead and subscribe now, and which would be a good time. You could also email me at Hosea International at yahoo.com, or Hosea INT Speaks at gmail.com. And you can give at either Venmo or at Cash App. This is Dr. Ray, and I'll see you next week on Hosea International Speaks.